Hello, everyone. Welcome to CWC Berkeley's 2025 May panel. I'm Keith Gabrey, the poet, author, and the president of the Berkeley Branch of the California Writers Club. Right now, we're going to have our May panel, which is an annual event we're super excited about. We're featuring Cory Doctorow, Carol Queen, and David Holper, and moderated by the one and only Kristen Caven. Uh, Kristen Caven is our Berkeley Branch historian and 2017 recipient of the Jack London Award. Um, as the CWC state writer in residence in Walking Miller Park, she mines Miller's writings and literary uh, consolation for inspiration. And um, and then this panel is part of Kristen's weekly interviews between Mother's and Father's Day this year, celebrating the launch of her audiobook, The Winning Family, Where No One Has to Lose, which views parenting as an act of resistance. In October, she received a grant to host Diamond Dirtle Day at Oakland's Oktoberfest.
Diamond Dirndl Day.
Diamond
Sorry.
Dirtle Day, yeah, featuring her animated play, The Dirndl Diaspora. And this is, if you want, Kristen, I can post your website
That'd be great. Thanks.
in the
Hmm.
in the chat. Um, and here's Kristen Cavan. Yeah.
All right. Hello, everybody. Before we begin, I'm gonna let's see, remove my spotlight because I want to just give credit to some of the people in the room, especially Cheryl Stewart, who's the one who was able to pull this panel together and ask me to moderate. But big shout out to Cheryl for pulling this together and making this happen. We do a panel every year in May. It's just kind of our tradition. And we've had so many ideas this year that really got galvanized after the election. And this spring has been just event after event that's sort of focused on justice, focused on resistance, focused on. We did the Literary Avengers for two different events. So thank you, Cheryl, and also thank you for the crack team that went out and flyered. I don't know if there are people here because they saw a flyer, but if so, it's thanks to our community. The California Writers Club is a quirky but close community of writers who support each other in every all the dimensions. Okay, I at this time we can start focusing. I'm going to introduce the hosts. I mean the our guests, our panelists. But just a little bit of housekeeping. We everybody can keep your mic on because the sound of laughter or clapping
Huh?
or snapping or whatever
No.
makes the room feel alive. But we will go ahead and mute you if you're giving random noises. And don't, it's nothing personal, but we've
That was
got
a useful
elves
demonstration.
behind the scenes watching on that. What a perfect example. Thank you, Sheila, for the opportunity. Um, and also Keith will record this for everyone who bought a ticket will also get a recording of this in their email. All right, so I have given this a lot of thought. This panel, it's been really fun to prepare. And can someone go ahead and put us all in the spotlight?
On it as soon as you start talking about it.
Okay, great. You've all been on my mind and in my ears. I've been listening to your TED Talks, your podcasts, your interviews. Friends, you can all read longer bios on me, but trust me, you've got some big voices here in the virtual room. Cory Doctorow, Carol Queen, and David Holper are all writers who are household names in certain households. And they've all got there by engaging with their communities as well as telling stories. They are all teachers. We've got a doctor of sexology. Like, who even knew that was a thing? We've got a double honorary doc of laws and computers. That's so cool. And we have a retired English professor with, I heard this in an interview, a terminal MFA, and we're sorry about that.
Uh,
And today we're all going to learn a lot from one another. Our theme is right to resist, writing to resist, but as I've been calling it, right to resist, because even if we're not professional writers, we all have fingers and keyboards. We can all pick up a marker and make a protest sign. We all have the ability to send a tweet or Facebook message to a radio station, like I did twice yesterday when I heard this terrifying ad by Christy Nome. Have you heard that? So I'm going to start with a general question and then see if we can home in on something really juicy. So, first of all, you just have to see what I'm wearing.
Yay! Thumbs up.
I want one.
Thumbs up.
So I personally have been writing a lot about harm prevention because it's so important for humans to get along. Like if we're going to survive, just to get along. And I'm not feeling very helpful or hopeful right now. Project 2025 is being jammed down our collective throats, and that's not a good sexual metaphor, Carol. People are being disappeared. So I'm just going to put my first question for all of you, and you can take turns answering it. Very simple. What do you write, and what do you resist? And I guess I'll call on someone because that'll save time. So let's start with Carol.
What I write? Well, I'm working on a memoir, although I gotta remember a lot of gadding about and goings on, so it's not going real fast, but it will evolve. I've walked through a lot of communities in my time, many of them, possibly most of them, sexual and identity based, but others too. And I write information about sex, commentary and think pieces about sex. I answer Q&As for journos who want to write some about sex in their blogs and their web magazines and this and that. I write erotic fiction and got a Firecracker Alternative Book Award once, I think, for one of those things. And also I've done some editing to bring voices into the room. So I think that's a decent praise about me.
And what do you resist in your writing? What are the things that you write against?
I certainly resist. I mean, I think intolerance, because there's a lot of ways that intolerance can show up, of course, but it absolutely shows up in sex and gender related identity communities, kink and fetish, the notion that we're not all the same and that there's a normal that we must all aspire to. That's the worst non-sex education any of you will ever have heard. People are right today having shitty sex because they think there's a way to do it. There are many, many ways to do it, of course. We might get into that, but all you have to do is flip around in Project 2025, and when they're not sending people to other countries never to be seen again, they're talking about our bodies and everybody's bodies, not even just women's bodies or reproductive rights related things, because it kind of covers the waterfront when it comes to sexuality and absolutely when it comes to gender identity. So I write against the people who are picking on those folks who have stepped up in the last, I don't know, 50 years plus to say, we're here. And some of them say we're queer, but not all of them do, of course. And to just try to claim a little space and a life in the world that doesn't have to be in the shadows and in the closet. And the more we allow people to shove people behind walls, the less we know about what happens to them when they get there. And it's not just the disappeared that this happens to. It always has. I remember in high school when a boy, who knows, disappeared And it turned out that he'd been caught cross-dressing, and none of us ever saw this person again. I hope they're out there somewhere in the gender identity they want, but I think they went to a special place for kids who weren't the same as other kids. And that can't continue to happen.
Disappearing is not a new thing. Yeah.
No, it sure isn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And can I just say, when you said we're here, we're queer, I heard, what do you hear after that? Anyone? We're not going shopping? I was like, wow, that's a real act of resistance
unmute
right
that
now.
Not going anywhere.
All right, let's moving. See, I see you guys like this, so let's go David next.
Okay, well, I think probably one of the ways that I write to resist is I write about my family history. My family was Jewish on both sides. My father, his family came out of Russia around the time of World War I, when my grandfather, because of prejudices against Jews and because of the deteriorating military situation, fled to Japan from Russia. And my grandmother and aunt followed him, and then they went on to Shanghai, to China. And my father was born in Shanghai. Eventually, when the Japanese invaded China, they came to Los Angeles and settled there. Um, and then on my mother's side, she and my grandmother lived in Berlin, and they were quite wealthy. My first grandfather had owned a porcelain factory along with his brother, and he had died in an automobile accident with his brother. And so my grandmother was a young, wealthy widow, and her brother luckily pressured her to leave Germany. And so she traveled to the United States in 1936 on her own, visited some friends, and then in 1937, she and my mother left. Before they left, though, my mother was thrown out of public school. They had a brick thrown through their living room window. They had to wear Star of David armbands. And when they did leave, the Nazis stole everything except for 10,000 Deutschmark. So they essentially stole millions of dollars from my grandmother's family. Uh, so even as a boy, resistance was a big part of the discussions at the dining room table. Uh, Now, after Trump's first term in office, I began a novel called The Church of the Very Last Chance. Here it is. Yeah. Um, and maybe the title and the cover's a little misleading, but it follows a Russian travel blogger who winds up getting stranded by COVID and then starts a very, very alternative spiritual movement that that appeals to like all sorts of marginalized communities and starts a number of social activism movements to disrupt the status quo both in Russia and in the United States and worldwide. And a good deal of that novel is political satire. So I had no idea that Trump would be reelected, but I definitely satirized him as well as all his MAGA minions. So there's a lot of fun. And I think for me, that's a big part of the way that I resist is through humor. Um, but I also do it through mythos and through the storytelling of how this woman is transformed through experience of resistance. So there's an awful lot in the book about ethnic minorities, women, the LGBT community, Muslims, Sikhs, immigrants, and others who are marginalized by these power structures. So I think the primary focus that I utilize in my resistance is not only drawing upon my family history, but also talking about the way that these fascist and totalitarian regimes label people. They put names upon them that can turn them into things that they can then deport or imprison or torture or kill. And to remind us of the humanity, the common humanity of all of these people, and and to draw our attention to that. So the entire novel is actually an act of resistance. And And I didn't know this when I was writing it, but it turned out to be very prophetic in terms of the events that have unfolded since Trump's reelection. So I encourage you, if you get a chance to read it. I think it's an interesting alternative history about how things might unfold, not how they are unfolding.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And how about you, Cory? What do you write and what do you resist?
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I write in many different genres and many different forms. Mostly I'm known as a science fiction novelist, but I've published more than 30 books in the last 25 or so years. Some of it's science fiction for adults, some of it's YA material, graphic novels for middle grade readers, picture book for little kids, lots of nonfiction on varying subject, collections of essays, books about tech policy, and more. I write when I'm anxious, and so that means that I've had a very prolific decade or so. I wrote 9 books during the lockdown, and have been out on tour since about 2022. I've also been a blogger for a quarter of a century. So I was one of the founders and remain one of the co-owners of a website called Boing Boing. That was one of the first widely read blogs. And I wrote sort of 10 to 15 blog posts a day for 19 years, tens of thousands of blog posts for Boing Boing. What I did effectively was switch from having a commonplace book like this, which, you know, I have several of them, but they're mostly just full of they're full of boggle words, because that's what my family does when we go on holiday, and they steal my notebooks. And instead of scratching notes to myself that I could make no sense of later, nor even if I could decipher my handwriting, could I decipher my intent, I switched to writing for public audiences, even those things that I was trying to make sense of rather than those things that I'd already made sense of. The act of keeping notes in public is a very mnemonic one. It requires that you apply rigor. Indeed, as you make those notes, they become a database, literally. I mean, your WordPress MySQL backend, but they also become a kind of figurative database, a kind of super saturated mental solution of fragments that are always jangling around, easier to pull together because you're always thinking about them. And that every now and again they will sort of crystallize and nucleate and create a kind of out of the blue story, speech, essay, what have you. I left Boing Boing about 5 years ago, and I launched a solo project that's ironically named Pluralistic, pluralistic.net. And it is longer form writing, and I've switched from writing sort of 5 to 10 blog posts a day to writing one pretty substantial essay 5 to 7 days a week, in addition to the other column work I do, and so on. And these tend to be more synthetic. They're pulling together all the work I've done for all those years and trying to make sense of it. It's a very fruitful act to do this. And in my other life, I'm an activist. I've worked with a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation there in the Bay Area now for 23 years. As an activist in various capacities. For many years, I was our European director and our representative at UN specialized agencies in Geneva and at the Parliament in Westminster and in Brussels. And so I spent a lot of time schlepping around, arguing with people about tech policy. And these are very abstract technical questions, sort of by definition. And sure, people eventually come to recognize that there's a problem there, but often that is beyond the point of no return. Right, that if you can't get people to recognize that there's a problem with tech policy before it's chewing their leg off, then oftentimes it's too late to do something about it. And so that kind of policy activism is often a matter of finding narratives, euphemisms, funny words, stories, analogies, metaphors that help people grasp the substance of these questions while they're still in a kind of nascent form, in order to try and make a difference. And writing that newsletter every day, writing blog posts every day, being in public with these ideas means that just to answer Linda, it's pluralistic.net, pluralistic.net, pluralistic.net. Anyway, that means that you're throwing a lot of darts and you eventually get a bullseye. And so I've had several of these where I have written things that have been very substantial and influential in these policy questions. In 2022, I coined a term, a funny, dirty word, in shitification, to describe how platforms decay. And it is a word that's fun to say. Academics like saying it. It gives them a minor license to profanity. Journalists love saying it. Radio journalists love tormenting their editors because the FCC won't let you put it on the air. And so they're always, using it and then making their editors find it, figure out how to bleep it, and so on. And it's really become not just a calling card or something that's fun because it's viral. It's not just like, oh, I'm the guy who figured out that you could like wear your underwear on the outside of your pants. Now everyone's doing it. It's a big, serious technical critique that is hung off of this fun little word, and the two combined turn out to be very powerful. So it was the word of the year in the US in 2023, and then in Australia and the UK last year in 2024. I am just turned in the not quite final manuscript for a book on the subject with Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Macmillan publishes most of my books. This is my first FSG book. And another Macmillan imprint, First Second, is doing a graphic novel adaptation. And there's a documentary film crew that's just got their angel funding that will pay for them to follow me on the road with the tour and do a road movie documentary based on it. So, a very successful way to carry over these technical critiques into the public eye. I find that so to carry on from like the kinds of things I write and now move into how that is an act of resistance. So I find that fiction and nonfiction pair very well in these policy questions. There's a kind of, I think, a canard that fiction that is didactic or preachy or something is wrong. I think that fiction is an art form, and art is the act of moving a big, numinous, irreducible, complex idea out of an artist's head into someone else's head through some intermediate medium, like a dance or a song or a book or what have you. And it happens that nearly all of my big, irreducible, complex ideas are my fears and aspirations for technology. And so that often finds its way into my fiction. And fiction is a great way to have a kind of architect's rendering and maybe a virtual fly-through of what a world might be like in the event that certain policy choices are taken, or that the policy path that we're on is not reversed. And it can create a sense of urgency. It can put some blood and sinew onto the dry bones of that academic or technical argument. And again, if there is a technical argument to be made as well, it can sit alongside of that book in some other form, in another book, in a speech, in what have you. Of course, we have writers who've done both. You have Orwell dropping like a 30-page essay into the middle of 1984 that is just a bunch of political science that he's very thinly figured out how to squeeze into the narrative. But I like doing it my way. I like having the fiction in one place and the nonfiction in another. As to what I resist, so I, as I said, my fears and aspirations about technology are the sort of center of my, and there is again a kind of canard that people like Electronic Frontier Foundation, but broadly people who were excited about technology in the 90s and 2000s were naifs, that we thought that if you would only give everyone technology, everything would automatically be fine. And maybe there were some people who felt that way. No one I know. I mean, look, I'm a cyberpunk writer, right? And I'm at great pains to repeat the mantra of William Gibson here. Cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion. People don't get involved with science, with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, because they think everything is going to be fine. You have to, on the one hand, be very excited about what technology could deliver, and also be very frightened about how badly it could go wrong. And I find that my adversaries in this matter, who are often tech giants, but sometimes policy people, sometimes, self-serving billionaires who may or may not be affiliated with tech giants, that what they want us to do is to abandon the imaginative act. They want us to conceive of a world that could not be any different from the world that we live in today. You know, Margaret Thatcher's famous maxim was, there is no alternative. She repeated this so often, they called her Tina, right? There is no alternative. And there is no alternative. You know, it's a demand dressed up as an observation, right? What she's really saying is stop trying to think of alternatives. And I'm a science fiction writer. I come up with a dozen alternatives before breakfast. And you have people like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Tim Cook or Sergey Brin who want you to think that there is no way for you to talk to your friends without Mark Zuckerberg spying on you from asshole to appetite, or that there is no way for you to have an easy to use mobile experience without giving Apple a total veto over all the technology you use and taking 30 cents out of every dollar that every creative worker makes on that platform. Or Sergey Brin wanting you to think there's no way to search the web without getting a blob of AI slop at the top of it and letting their shareholders have all the data that is possible to gather about you. And the idea that you can't separate these, it's a powerful and wrong idea. And if we fall into their trap, then we end up in this world where it's like, well, I understand you don't like that these platforms are being used for systematic harassment, disinformation control, advertising, surveillance, and so on. But what are you going to do? Do you want to go back to a world where there's no digital tools? Because the digital tools, this is the way they work. They cannot asking for talking to your friends without surveillance is like asking for water that's not wet. And, you know, if you have some technical nous, and if you can impart that technical nous, you can effectively help people create demands that are both inspiring, but at the same time reasonable, demands that are achievable. And maybe you can move them into the policy domain as well, because political will, it's hard to measure, but it's real. My main area of focus in the last 5 years has been tech antitrust. And, you know, I know with great pleasure that Google has been adjudicated a monopolist 3 times in the last 18 months. Facebook looks set to lose a lawsuit. Apple has just been referred for criminal prosecution for lying to a judge about its conduct in relation to the remedies order in an antitrust lawsuit that it lost, and so on. And the most amazing thing about this tech antitrust stuff, and it's happening everywhere, Australia, Canada, the EU and some of its member states, Spain, France, Germany, even China has got this super muscular tech antitrust regime, South Korea, Japan. The amazing thing about all of this is there's no dark money pool funding it. I mean, God, I wish there was, because my kid's about to start college, right? All of this stuff is just grassroots. Like, our political class has woken up and said there is nothing we can do except antitrust, or we're going to get our asses kicked. And this is amazing. And, you know, it's amazing to see it continue to a certain extent under Trump, but also to have the slack picked up by other countries. And I really think that if we can gut these oligarchies and the firms that defend them or that create them, then a lot of the other problems we have that relate to the alienation and rage of living in a society of increased wealth and income inequality and worsening chances for everyday working people, that much of that will be diffusable.
Wow.
Wow.
Big breath.
Yeah, exactly. That last thing you said is so inspiring, that we need to gut the oligarchs, and that you know, and how amazing it is that this antitrust movement is like, that's a little bit of hope, right? That's something that's hopeful. I have more questions prepared for you guys, but our time is limited, and I'm wondering if maybe you'd like to talk to each other at all. If any of you would like to respond to what you heard first. So I'd just like to invite that. Does anybody have a question for either of the other panelists? Okay.
I have a question for Cory.
Oh, sure.
First, you know, probably 4 days out of 7, I do want to go back to the time when there was no electronic media. And so I'll just be a voice of that resistance. The fucking Luddite resistance is in the house, but also, uh, the little tiny thumbnail story I told of disappearance in my introduction suggests that if we did that, we'd still have a lot of people to put up with. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the way that these technologies, plus the people who control and utilize them for dissent creation. What you think about that, and how do you think we might be able to pry in there and try to change that tendency? Because it seems like that's what the internet's for now, not just cat pictures, not just porn.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting you mentioned the Luddites. I think of myself as a Luddite, but in the original sense. So the meaning of Luddite in the contemporary world is really a tribute to the idea that history is written by the winners. So the
Yeah.
Luddites weren't anti-technology, right? Luddites were skilled technical tradespeople. To be a textile worker at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution was a 7-year apprenticeship. It was like getting a master's degree at MIT. They were not afraid of machines. Right. What Luddites wanted to do is what science fiction writers do. They wanted to challenge the social relationship of the gadget. Right. They didn't want to abolish the gadget. They were angry that their bosses wanted gadgets that were, quote, so easy a child could use them, because that way they could kidnap war orphans from the Napoleonic War orphanages of London, bring them to Manchester and indenture them for a decade to work on these machines, right? And in so doing, break the power of the textile guilds, break worker power. So they weren't anti-technology at all, and they certainly weren't afraid of technology. What they wanted to do was alter the social relation. And there's a great book about this by my friend Brian Merchant called Blood in the Machine that came out last year, and I really recommend that. The other thing I'll recommend, there's a memoir of one of these children who worked in the mill, Robert Blinko, that was a giant bestseller in England during the Industrial Revolution. And it was so influential that it inspired Dickens to write Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist is Luddite fanfic. So I am a Luddite as well. I am as critical of tech as you could want, but I think it's important to train your criticism on the things that they do and not necessarily the things they claim they can do. So one of the things that tech makes a lot of claims about is their ability to change our minds. And the reason they do that is they sell advertising. And if you are an advertising salesman, being able to claim to have invented a mind control ray is a marketing claim. But everyone who's ever claimed to have invented a mind control ray was lying, right? Mesmer, Rasputin, MK Ultra, pickup artists, neurolinguistic programming weirdos, right? All of them liars, charlatans, or deluded, or all of the above. The evidence for tech's mind control ray is pretty thin. But here's what tech does do. They hold you hostage. You're on Facebook because, that's where the people who have the same rare disease as you are hanging out. And then someone else is on Facebook that really matters to you, but they're stuck there because that's where their kid's little league team organizes the carpool. And then a third friend is there because that's where their audience or their customers are. And then someone else has moved from another country, and the only way they can get in touch with those people is to be on Facebook. And so Facebook holds us hostage by our love. And so long as we love each other more than we hate Mark Zuckerberg, we are stuck on Facebook. People are angry, and Facebook is good at targeting people based on their anger. That is what Facebook has, as a way to find traits. But Facebook, I don't think, creates those traits. I think the alienation for our institutions, the outrage, the fear, I think that those are upstream of Facebook. And to the extent that Facebook is creating them, they're creating them because of their impunity, which is indicative of the impunity of the entire corporate sector, right? That they are run by monsters who do monstrous things, become incredibly wealthy as a result, and never face any consequences, which, swap out the industry and you've got opioid barons, or you've got people who make cars that spy on you, or you've got the airlines who, do you know the flight attendants, the contract that they just got was the first contract in the history of flight attendants that pays them for the time before the door closes in the airplane and it takes off. They did unpaid labor from the moment they crossed the security checkpoint to the moment the door closed, which could be like 4 hours of a shift, right? So of course people are willing to believe conspiratorial accounts because they live in a conspiracy. It's a very boring conspiracy of oligarchy, of monopoly, of exploitation. And so I think we should make sure that we're not doing what Lee Vinsel calls crita-hyping Facebook by affirming their claims of having made a mind control ray. The last thing we want is for a Facebook prospectus to go out to investors saying, why should you invest in Facebook? Well, I don't know if you've heard, but our critics will tell you we built a mind control ray. And, we don't want people making a sales call on that basis. I think we need to really understand the origin of their power. And if we want to break it, we should make it easy to leave Facebook. So when Facebook started, everyone had a MySpace account. And Mark Zuckerberg's pitch to those people was MySpace is better than Facebook, or Facebook is better than MySpace because we promise we will never, ever spy on you. But he knew that people wouldn't come to Facebook and just read the privacy policy. They wanted to be with their friends. And so he said, okay, here's a bot. You give it your login and your password. It will go to MySpace several times a day, grab everything waiting for you, bring it back, stick in your Facebook inbox. You can read it and reply to it. So you don't have to choose between Facebook and your friends. You can get either one. Now do that to Facebook today, and they will nuke you till you glow. They'll say you violated Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, patent, copyright. You're a tortious interferer with contracts, right? If we mandate that Facebook has to interoperate with other services like Blue Sky, Mastodon, and so on, so that you can leave Facebook, leave Zuckerberg's moderation choices, leave his fact-checking choices, leave his surveillance choices, but still be in touch with the people who matter to you, then what we do is we strike at Mark Zuckerberg's power. Rather than telling him he needs to use his power more wisely, we need to take his power away.
I noticed, Cory, that I can't find you on Substack or Blue Sky, which are these new spaces that supposedly, you can take your things with you. And I'm wondering if that's because you're staying where the fight is.
I just
Still on
self-host.
X.
So I'm still on X so once Blue Sky allows you to self-host, I'm switching from Twitter. I'm on Twitter because I fell for it. I knew the people who started Twitter. I trusted them. I built a career there. I've got 500,000 followers. I need to sell books. My kid's going to college in the fall. But as soon as I can leave, I will. But I'm not going anywhere I can't self-host ever again. I'm never going to trust another billionaire.
That's a
So
lesson, that we've all learned.
I'm Blue Sky sounds like they're pretty close to it. I have a friend who's quite techie and has a machine in a server room in Toronto. He's upgrading it the next time he's back in town, and then we're going to upgrade that machine and put a Blue Sky server and a Mastodon server on it.
So, because I think the theme I'm actually starting to look for here is, well, first of all, just kind of from what everyone's saying is just this feeling of progress is all about resistance. The world is made of ignorance. The world is made of power. And everything that's been progress, from way back, you've each mentioned a story of struggle and resistance. And coming to the flight attendants, as the most recent one, is like all correct things happen because people resist ignorance and because people push against this boundary. It's like the bleeding edge of human rights, the bleeding edge of dignity. And so let's start looking for, for those things that can really, that we can all kind of lean in together and realize that what we're doing is creating a vision, like Cory, just the vision of the self-hosted, social media. It's a lesson that we've learned, and so I think I'm gonna ask you guys all to start focusing more on give us visions, what we can use. And so I have. Let me see. We've got a couple questions in the chat, but I really did want to call out some of these issues. So let me just throw something to Carol now. 30 years ago, San Francisco and especially the gay community faced an extinction level event threat as the science gave us new understanding of what the AIDS virus was and how it spread. It forced new conversations. So, and you can also, in your answer to this, tell us about the word that you created, which is really important. So, how did writing help individuals and the public feel safer and take back control? And is there any advice you can give to today's younger writers who are resisting the resistance to the new life-saving language that's been developed since then? You know, the complex language that's been simplified to that one four-letter word? Like that everybody's anti-woke, because that would be cool. So anyway, what can you say about that?
Well, the first thing that I want to say about being anti-woke is that they don't even know what they're talking about. They don't know the backstory of this word. They don't know the cultural connotations of this word. And it, I mean, I think of the old political party about whose policies I know very little, but their name stays with me always, the Know Nothings. Please, people, understand what's going on around you. I mean, I think Cory was absolutely right about the shut down the vision. Folks have been on the right have been working against the public school system for decades and decades and decades. In my school, we did have a world history course. That saved a lot of possibilities of knowledge and resistance, idea making from those of us who didn't go any further in our education. But let me talk about HIV/AIDS and the writing piece. And San Francisco was already an extraordinary place. In its, if people stop thinking about it at the beats in the summer of love, and then they're like, oh, and then some other stuff happened. Well, they miss what then came down the pike, which is just a flowering of sex education modalities, pretty much all of them alt in nature, much more inclusive than anything that anyone had ever had. Not that anybody back then had had good sex education. And if you've had good sex education now, it's because you're either a Scandinavian or a Unitarian. So that was a thing to get the sex ed, and that's where I step into San Francisco, is stepping into that tradition. Also, though, there was gosh, there are a lot of different kinds of people here. Let's start gathering us together, finding our likes, finding our comparables, finding the people we should be trying to have sex with, because if we want a certain set of things and we think there's only one way to have sex, a lot of strife can happen in relationships. So let's make our spaces. Let's make our organizations, let's name them, let's give our sexual orientations more different names and language around it. And that grew a queer community, certainly, but not only a queer community in the area that we've been experiencing of ever since, partly because we had to, because that was the basis not only of people being connected with each other to the point where they might, under certain circumstances, especially early on before we knew what was going on, get HIV, because sexual community was built. It was sexual community has maybe kind of always been around, but most people haven't had access to it. That's
Most people don't even know what that is. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'll say, one of the ways that I'll say that I'm contextualizing sexualized community here is both people who find each other on the basis of identity and interest, and it is a kind of identics, it's a riff. It's a riff from the racial and cultural and other religious and spiritual identity politics that already were flying around in the 60s and into the 70s. But then
Well, and back in the
And way back before
1900s
that
too.
time
Yeah.
too, sure. And the other thing that it is if people want a particular kind of sexual experience in a place like San Francisco, there was community built so that they could find places to go and have it. Kink dungeons, bathhouses, varieties of, again, not totally new entities, but way new for most people to be able to, if they knew where to look, learn that they were there and maybe get an invitation. So,
Can you tell us about your word that
are
you,
you talking about absexuality?
yeah, the one that's on Wikipedia under your name? Yeah. Yeah.
It's very kind. Um, one day, I had already started writing about all this diversity stuff. There was a lot of action having to do with censorship in those days, and who would ever want to censor Annie Sprinkle, for heaven's sake? She's a goddess. It's the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, was stepping on performance artists because they didn't like the content, and a lot of it was riffing off the sexual questions and the sexual importance of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, not to mention the stuff that I was just talking about. And so we started to say in a conversation, my partner Robert and me, Betty Dodson, the mother of masturbation, uh, and who else was there? I think it may have just been the three of us. What unites Andrea Dworkin, the feminist anti-porn activist and writer, and Jesse Helms, the Southern conservative? And
Right.
what I thought and think that one of the things that unites them is that some people look at sexuality, especially sexuality that isn't their own lived experience, and what they think is normative, experience feelings about it, some of them arousal and internalized erotic feelings that they cannot say, I'm feeling erotic about that thing that is objectively terrible. No one should be doing that. No one should be that way. But nevertheless, I'm really activated right now. And so I'm going to fulminate. And I'm going to fulminate and say as many dirty words and names of porno magazines and movies, etc., as I can. And they're jacking themselves up as they do. Just watch an old Jesse Helms video. Sodomy! He was all over that shit all the time.
So obsessed. Yes.
We have some people like that now. And I think absexuality is a word that explains what I almost think of as a sexual orientation, although there is no ethical way to do any research on this, because people are pushing it away, but they're always touching it. They've always got at least their fingertips right on because they're so invested in focusing on that stuff. So that's my little word. And I got to say that the diversity and the bomb that went off, it was HIV/AIDS, and certainly in San Francisco. In San Francisco, there were people who knew that you had to step up and talk to people, frankly, about sex. And that's in some ways the reason that we have this whole notion of sex positivity now. There was a time when the old ways of just being pretty quiet about it, having those conversations in lower voices and not having it be in the newspaper or any other publicly accessible place. Well, maybe that was fine when lots of people that we cared about weren't dying all the time, but it wasn't fine in the age of HIV/AIDS. And ever since, there have been more opportunities for frankness and sexualized opinion and erotic writing and all of those things, because we had to do that to save a bunch of lives. We were already trending in that direction, of course. I'm not saying that all of that stuff was invented in the 80s. It was not. But that flared it up, and the flare has not died down. And that's one of the things that the anti-woke folk really hate, is that there is now just so much more discourse, and their kids might hear it, and one important person's kid did hear it. They're doing great. Talking
More than one, I think. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Elon kid right now when I say that.
I just went to Ron Reagan when you said
Represent.
that. Yeah.
And but yes, so many, so many.
Yeah.
And the why don't power hungry people understand that when you start attacking people, they're going to want to rise up to protect one another and themselves? Because, you know, there were probably subtler things that all those idiots could have done, but they're not doing those subtle things.
Well, the
Maybe they
thing
are.
is,
I mean, sure they are, but they're doing things that make it clear that we have to step up.
I loved it when you said, what do Andrea Dworkin and Jesse Helms have in common? Because that like kind of buzzed in my head that like, what do opposing forces have in common? What do we have in common with, those who resist? Death unifies us. What just everybody was dying from AIDS. We had to get together and realize that we all have physicality. We
That's
all
right.
have sexuality. We all have spirituality. And we all have technology. What Cory was saying about, the things that bring us to Facebook are so diverse, but yet we're all united in this stuck place where we're constantly being bombarded now with ads and being shitified in all of our online spaces. So it's 2:20. Let me just ask you panelists, can you guys stay a little longer? Because this is so juicy. I don't want to stop it in 15 to 10 minutes. And there's a little bit more to unpack here. Well, there's a lot more to unpack, but if we could have a little more time. I'm going to throw out a question to David. You're the silent guy in the room, but you are still so full of. You're probably not silent in other rooms, but this is a very loud room. So I just okay, just coming way back to when I was listening to you. I get my community here to read the original California writers now and then, and just to keep their voices alive, to keep tabs on history, which was so much exactly like right now, and so much to learn from it. And one of our top faves is the borderline magical Ina Coolbrith, who was California's first poet laureate. And we also have Oakland's first poet laureate in our membership, Ayodele Nzinga, and she's pretty magical too.
Mhm.
And she says, politicians come and go, but poetry gives voice to the people, the citizens, the ones who clean up after us all. So, as another pandemic poet, another first poet laureate, how do you find yourself speaking to power? Or is everything copacetic and agreeable in Humboldt County? So what battles do Renaissance men like yourself fight?
Yeah, everything's just fine here in Humboldt. We have none of the problems that the rest of you are experiencing. Um, well, let's see. One of the things that came up while I was poet laureate, like I was given the role of poet laureate by the City Council of Eureka, and starting to organize events here in the community where I was going to gather together writers and introduce these writers to the community. And the pandemic hit and everything was canceled. So everything had to go online. But one of the things that I had really taken note of was that in 2019, the council um, returned land to the Wiyot tribe that had been taken from them in the 19th century after an incident where there was genocide against the Wiyot, who were gathering for their world renewal ceremony on Tuluwat Island. Um, and then the land had been out of their control for all that time up until 2019. And through a variety of uh, moves, the city council eventually decided to return the land to the Wiyot. And what was significant about this, and that I really wanted to publicize, was that this was the first gift of land returned to any tribe in the United States by a government body. Like it hadn't happened before, which really just was stunning to me that like no city council or municipality had done that before.
What year was that?
I was 19.
When? Say again.
I believe it was in 2019. I don't have the date in.
Okay.
Um, so I
Yeah.
thought it was a big deal. And um, the California report had reached out to me just because I was appointed as the inaugural poet laureate for the city of Eureka because they were just starting this program. But to me, it was a much bigger deal that the city had returned this land to the Wiat. So I wound up writing a poem about it called Tuluat Island that not only talked about the genocide that had happened on Tuluat Island, but also what followed for the Wiat, which was they lost their lands, they were taken into custody essentially by the U.S. government at Fort Humboldt here in Eureka. Their kids were taken away from them and put into boarding schools in which they were no longer allowed to speak Wiat or practice Wiat cultural traditions. Um, and along with that, you had the influx of alcoholism and drugs and all the other things that negatively affected the Wiat. And so, but eventually the land was returned, and the Wiat, for the first time in, quite some in decades, did their world renewal ceremony on Tuluat Island. And so when I wrote the poem, and I think this is part of the act of resistance. I knew of the Wiyot, but I didn't know any Wiyot directly. So a friend of mine who I taught with at College of the Redwoods, where I taught all those years, said, well, you should go talk to Ted Hernandez, the tribal chair for the Wiyot. So I did. I went out and read him the poem. And he actually said, well, I got to make a few suggestions here because this isn't exactly historically correct. And there are other things that you're probably not aware of. And it was great. So we went back and forth for, I don't know, about an hour. And and I wrote down all his suggestions and and wound up revising the poem based on his suggestions. And I asked him too, since there are some Wiyot who still speak and write in the original language. There aren't a lot of them, but he reached out to a woman who's fluent in Wiyot who wrote an epigram for the poem in Wiyot. So the the city's deal was that there's a local arts organization called the Ink People that did this poet laureate program as well, and they created a broadside of the poem with the Wiyot epigram, and I wound up getting a framed copy and giving it to Ted. And just recently, the Wiyot opened a tribal center for the public in downtown Eureka, and that poem hangs on his wall in Ted's office. And I feel so honored that, like that I got to be a part of that. And I think to me, that's part of the act of resistance. And I really want to make a point of that because I was thinking about that before today's session. Um, because we have to build bridges. I mean, it's really important that we reach out to people that we don't normally communicate with. So I was thinking about this, and it's probably as many of that the idea that you need about 3.5% of a population in active resistance through nonviolent direct action to begin to either undermine a totalitarian or fascist regime or to basically give it the boot. And that's from a study that
3.5. That's pretty low. We can do that.
yeah, although think about this, that the hands-off protests, I think the first one had around 5 million people. So we need about double that.
Okay.
So, that's not going to happen unless people like the people in this group, especially writers, are reaching out to people through their writing or through their activism, because we're going to need more like 11 million people. And so, what does that mean? It's going to mean, well, probably not everybody who's progressive. We're going to have conservatives in there. We're going to have people who didn't vote, who didn't care. We're going to have people who are independents. We're going to have people who are Green Party. We're going to have all sorts of people, but we're going to have to, build bridges to get that many people to do it. The other thing I really want to point out is that, oh, and by the way, there's a book that I would recommend called Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. And in it, the authors Chenoweth and Stephen They analyzed 323 political and social movements that challenged repressive regimes from 1900 to 2006. And they show that in repeated efforts of this sort, you can undermine a totalitarian or fascist or autocratic regime. So there's lots of historical evidence that this sort of thing can be done. We're not used to that. I'd say maybe in the current day in the United States, but you go back and look at the historical record in the United States. There's been a lot of resistance in previous decades. Now, next thing I want to say, and then I'll yield the floor to my much wiser colleagues here. I'm just so impressed with Carol and Cory. I mean, I just feel like I'm the small potatoes of the group. Like I have a great deal of respect for these two. And that is, I think I was just talking with a bookstore owner here locally in McKinleyville, and we were talking about resistance, and she's saying, well, I get on my Call 5 app and I make my phone calls and I send in my postcards and I email and I call my representatives. And I said, well, that's all well and good. But I said, your government isn't responsive to you. And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, there's been a number of studies about this very thing. Like I looked it up, I couldn't remember the details, but Professor Martin Gillens from Princeton University and Benjamin I. Page from Northwestern University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a simple question. And this question was, is the government responsive to voters? And the answer is categorically no, they are not. They are not responsive to voters. Their conclusion is that our elected officials almost never respond to voter concerns. Rather, they're singularly responsive to the wealthy and to large corporations, primarily because these folks, following the US Supreme Court Citizens United decision in 2010, pour as much money as they can into elections. And the result, we have the best government that money can buy.
Yeah.
What we need to do, therefore, is we need to galvanize about 11 million Americans to start using not necessarily postcards or phone calls. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but that's not what is going to change things. And we need, I would say we need economic resistance. The Tesla protests, the Target boycott, when we start affecting the dollars, the bottom line of large corporations, and we begin to shift the economic burden onto corporations and wealthy individuals, then our resistance is going to become much more profound, and it's going to be taken notice of. So anyway, I'll just wrap up with that.
Ooh. Well, that was remarkably and poetically stated. As we wrap up, I would like to encourage everybody who can type to put in websites for the ones that you're working with. For me, it's Election Truth Alliance. If somebody could drop that in, .org. 5 calls. We are all out there working in different aspects, and the more that we can, create energy away from the marketplace. You're absolutely right, David. Thank you so much for stating all of that. Did you know that we had a land back right here in Oakland as well, up in Joaquin Miller Park? Yeah.
Yay.
And that one was like the first women organized, we have a land back group here where the land was rematriated. And that is such a powerful statement of healing and such a vision for moving forward. Like we really have to visualize, 100 years from now, every single municipality has land owned by the original tribes, has them in the city council, has them as part of, the fabric of our government, which we really do need to remake without money. And in Oakland, we've had these terrible, ugly politics, where there's billionaires who are doing recall elections in every progressive race in the Bay Area. And I don't know if, anyway, I could go on. Let me just do my last question, and then we can open it up a little bit more. So, one of the big problems was with resistance, and this was from a conversation with President Keith. is how we alienate each other when we resist. This is crazy what's happened to me this last couple of weeks in my my arts organizations, in my, my work in the arts. Like, people have been getting their feelings hurt and attacking each other, and alienating each other, and but I keep thinking about this fact I learned: how the Nazis got elected was they divided the left against the left. And like, I'm just seeing, like, it's really hard for people to get along. Um, is anyone here familiar with the work of Loretta Ross, or her name? Yeah, Carol. So she has a TED talk about calling in versus calling out. I'll drop it in the text. And she says things like, when you treat potential allies as enemies, you're acting as a cult, like a cult. And she says, fighting a hater should be fun. It's being a hater that should suck, or that sucks. Okay, but here's the thing about all of you guys. Wait, let me just drop this link in, save it for later. You all, none of your writing feels preachy. I've read enough of all of your writing to know that part of your power and access comes from this calling in. Maybe you don't, whether or not you know people are doing it, you're doing it. So one of the best things I read recently was Cory's solar punk science fiction novel, The Lost Cause.
Oh, thanks.
In which, and also I just wanted to say, you guys are not in silos. Cory writes great sex scenes. Carol, there's a spirituality in what you do, and David, it's like, your protagonist is an influencer, in working the tech realm. And I also encourage everybody to read that novel. It just sounds great, and I've heard interviews about it, but I haven't read it yet, but I want to. But in The Lost Cause, the protagonist is forced to be in relationship with his MAGA grandpa's community. And when the boom is finally lowered on them after the crisis, they're all tied up and stripped of their weapons. It's just this really well-earned moment dramatically. It's so full of all these choice words, and it's one of those moments where it is a manifesto, but you don't realize that, because he's put it into science, into this fiction, so it doesn't come across as preachy. It's one character preaching to another, and it's so much better than the payback that we've been gunning for, the whole time. So it's excellently crafted dramatically for suspense. So Cory, can you speak a little bit to the question of how do we keep our enemies close when we really want to chase them with baseball bats?
That's a good one. It occurs to me there was something I meant to say earlier when you asked about, or rather when Carol asked about not wanting to use technology. So I was raised by activists, and I was always an activist in my life. I grew up in Toronto, like all the best Americans. I'm Canadian, and I spent many long winter nights on a bicycle with a basket with a bucket of wheat paste and a brush and a bunch of flyers to get people out to a demonstration. And look, if you think we're going to build a mass movement without digital tools when our adversaries have them, if you think that we're going to mobilize people to come and stop the next Charlottesville when they've got the internet and all we've got is wheat paste, I got a bucket of wheat paste for you. It's see how you like it and then come back. So we got to seize the means of computation. We can't abandon the field for the worst people in the world to get all the best toys. So I have a theory of how things change. You might even call it a theory of change. And it basically says that if you see a group of people trying to make something happen for a long time and they have been failing and then they succeed, every now and again it's because they thought of something really cool to do, a new way to do something. So you get things like Obama's digital tactics in like 2008 2007, which were pretty sharp. 99.9% of the time, if there's a group that's been on the outside and suddenly they're making headway, it's because they formed a coalition. And coalitions are difficult, they're fractious by definition. Right? A coalition is a bunch of groups who want different things. right? If they wanted the same thing, they'd just be a group, right? We call it a coalition because they want different things. And sometimes they can march together for a long time, and then at the end they've got to figure out how to divide the spoils once they've won. We're seeing some of that in Trump land. Sometimes they figure out how to resolve their differences. It's not always clear what's going to happen. My friend James Boyle, who runs the Duke Center for the Public Domain in North Carolina, he says that before the term ecology came along, there were people who cared about owls and people who cared about the ozone layer, but they didn't know they cared about the same thing, right? The gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere is not automatically and easily connectable to the destiny of charismatic nocturnal avians, right? But this one term turns a bunch of issues into a movement and pulls them together. When we look at what's happening on the right, it's a coalition. And, Project 2025 is a remarkable work of literature for many reasons. But among other things, it's very boring, which means that very few people have read it. Which is interesting because it's worth reading. So there's a historian I dote on, a guy called Rick Perlstein, who wrote Nixon Land and Reagan Land. He's a leftist historian of right-wing movements. Might be the only person who's read all of Project 2025. And what he points out is that Project 2025 is riven with contradictions, just full of absolutely irreconcilable contradictions about policy. So it not only says that we will have tariffs, it also says we'll have no tariffs. It not only says that we're going to deport people, it also says that we're going to make it easier to have guest worker programs that challenge unionized shops, and that weaken American labor, especially after the Biden years where we saw increased employment and labor starting to have the whip hand over capital. And that if you think about this as an anthology, so some of you may have edited an anthology, I've edited an anthology. Generally, like as an anthologist, there's things that you put in because you think they belong there, and there's things that you put in because you get in trouble if you didn't put them in there, right? And what we can infer from the presence of multiple irreconcilable, mutually exclusive major policy papers in Project 2025 is that the coalition that Heritage Foundation was repping for, and that they were doing their editorial work for, is full of people who are all of them such big beasts that none of them can be said no to. And they don't want the same things. And so this is a roadmap to shattering the Trump coalition. Trump coalition's full of turkeys who voted for Christmas. I have the weirdest injury right now. I went to a tiki cocktail party and wore a seashell necklace and got contact dermatitis from it. So I was at the Kaiser. I was at the. I have a tiki drinker injury, and I was at the Kaiser urgent care yesterday in LA, and my nurse was an Iranian refugee who told me that she'd voted for Trump because she felt like the wrong people were getting into the country, and she came in the right way. So it's full of people who should know better but don't for one reason or another. And these are coalitional members begging to be peeled off. If you read or listen to Naomi Klein, you'll know that this is what the right has done to us. Steve Bannon is very, very good at finding the fracture lines in the left and exploiting them. And not just in the left, in the progressive movement, because the progressive movement isn't all left. It includes a lot of liberals who, frankly, don't like left-wing policies. This is what I mean when I say we march together and then we reach a point where we can't decide how to divide the spoils and the knives come out. There's a lot of liberal policies that are not leftist policies, and vice versa, and that can't be reconciled with them, and some that are. I mean, there's a kind of caricatural liberal that doesn't want a world run by 150 white men, but if half of those white men were replaced with women and black people and people of color and queer people, that would be just fine, right? And as a leftist, I just don't want a world where 150 people run it, irrespective of their identities, right? And so, that those contradictions are difficult to paper over, and sometimes they will be so meaningful that you'll have to divide up, right? Sometimes there will be conflicts that can't be reconciled. And sometimes there will be room for reconciliation. And some of that will be down to comedy, COMITY, not comedy. And, this is a thing that we hear a lot about, and at its best, being able to understand the humanity of people who you mostly agree with but disagree sharply with on some issues is really important. And that is where those personal relationships come in. It's where you can say, look, you want this, it's terrible. We can't do that. I'm sorry, but I love you, and we can still be members of a coalition on other issues, as opposed to this kind of purity culture where people who disagree with you about one thing are irredeemable on everything. And yeah, you got to have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out your ears. And so there are times maybe where you do have to sever the tie. And I don't think it's a science. I think it's an art. I have lost friends who advocate for genocide. I've lost family members who advocate for genocide. Uh, and not just recently. It started when my grandfather's friends walked out of my bar mitzvah because my rabbi was a two-state solution rabbi. And it's been going on all my life. And, it is what it is, and it is how it goes. But you don't have to be alienated from everyone. And I know people who consider themselves Zionists that I consider my friends, because we can see each other's humanity, and because that has made us both better at what we advocate for.
Thank you. Thank you all. This is amazing. Karma's already got her hand up. I can't wait to hear what Karma has to say. Let's see. I'm trying to decide whether we want to just turn off the spotlights now and have a conversation. Yeah, let's do that. Let's remove spotlights. Let's just have a round of applause first for our panelists. And then we're just
All right, thank you.
we're going to take off the spotlights and just have conversation until the
Why
cows come
take the
home.
spotlights off? They can
So we
still
can see you.
Okay, the other person will still pop up when they start talking.
Will they? Okay, then. Sorry, Carol.
Don't worry.
All right, pop on up.
Okay. So I'm going to be a total jerk and do one of those long-winded questions. I've been trying to think about how to say this succinctly, and I'm going to fail at that. So I've been thinking a lot about, Cory, how you launched into the stratosphere by making your books, well, not by, but with talent, but you did so in making your books free and releasing them with a copy left. And as a writer, I'm always, and as a book promotion strategist, I'm always telling authors, like, give away more of your books. Don't be shy. Don't gatekeep. Come at folks with a strategy of abundance that you have more to offer. And yet, when it comes to my own writing, I know that most places that take poetry have no interest in poetry that has been previously published. And so I'm just terrified, like, oh, if I put my poetry anywhere, it is trash and no longer publishable. So my question, I guess, primarily for Cory, but of course you guys are all welcome to open in on it, is if you could speak a little bit to what that process was like for you in putting your books out there, and maybe try to talk me into it a little bit and talk about some of the rewards of that, aside from just the courage of your conviction and the moral rewards of it. Because I also know that, when I was promoting musicians and when I was promoting books, that in both cases, we would always give those works away for free to reviewers. And, I would give out CDs at drag shows to try to promote the bands. And that, if these brands are willing to do this, to put that work out there for free, it must have some benefit for those authors. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and kind of encourage authors to put their work out there so that I could be more brave.
I'm keenly aware that I've spoken rather a lot, and so I would like to give my co-panelists the opportunity to speak if they have something to say here.
But Cory, she's been wondering that for the last 15 years since I've known her. This is her chance.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying I won't speak. I just want to yield the floor first. So I want to give David and Carol a chance to weigh in if they have something to say, and if they don't, I'm happy to go first as well.
I can do a little abbreviated statement about that. My work has always been small press and zine, and later on some websites and this and that. And that's an alt space on one level that allows a certain kind of reader to trust the material, right? It also means that I'm too fucking scattered and ADHD to go find an agent, etc. It also means that. But the effects of that are that almost everything that I think is my most meaningful work is out of print largely, and isn't
Which is what?
is out of print largely.
What book is that?
Well, when you try to find a copy of Real Live Nude Girl, for example, you can find used copies for $650 depending on how you look, where you look. And I got to tell you that some people, when I tell them that, say, "Oh, that's great," and I'm like, that is the opposite of great. That is an access question that makes my soul shrink. Also, there's another thing I wrote that I get a $6.47 royalty check for every year. And I have lived my life doing a day job and having a patchwork of side hustle work, partly because the space in which I've worked doesn't sustain me economically. And I think there's an awful lot currently of notion that all this centuries or more of writing should just get fed into a hopper and be utilized by people who are not on the side of the people. So I have a lot of worries about all that stuff. It doesn't mean that I would have wanted to have a different writing life exactly, or still want to have one, but it does mean that I'm pretty acutely aware of the ways in which this is activist behavior rather than economic behavior for so many people. That's all I want to say about it.
I think I
Yeah.
can say something.
Go ahead, David.
Oh yeah, thanks, Cory. I think I can say something, Karma, to your question in terms of I think it's a marketplace question. Um, when I did my second book of poems, it had a lot of political poetry in it. And a good deal of it had already been published individually. And then a friend of mine who's a publisher decided to go forward with it. But I had sent that book out to several publishers. I think at least two had accepted it, but one of them was I don't know, they didn't have a very good designer, and when they put the cover design together, I said I don't like this. I'd rather use this image, and it was a photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge under construction. And the publisher got back to me and said, well, it's probably copyrighted. And I told her, no, it's not actually. It was in the public domain. And so she turned her designer loose on it, and the designer came up, actually ruined what was a really terrific photograph. So I said, well, look, let's tear up the contract. I really, if we can't even agree on a cover, then I don't want you to publish this book. So when I contracted with my friend to do the book, I said, I want control of the cover. And she reluctantly agreed and badgered me about it, trying to show me other designs that she wanted, but I stuck to my guns. After that, I did a book of poems which were based on untranslatable words from other languages, and the book is called Language Lessons. And it was accepted by a publisher, and the contract came back that was so awful that I just said, thanks, but no thanks. And I wound up self-publishing it instead. So I've used conventional publishers, and I've also self-published work that I felt like I wanted control over. And in doing that, I learned a lot about how to put a book together. So I would say, as far as I'm concerned, it's okay to use a conventional publisher. Like that's fine. But, in the with the latest publisher who accepted this book of pandemic poems that I wrote, when they accepted it, I said, I'd like to put an addendum to the contract that I have control over the cover. And the publisher said, well, we can't do that because it's going to cost too much to consult with a lawyer. I said, well, then just put it in
Jeez.
writing that you're going to allow me control of the cover, and I'll show you what the cover looks like before we do it. So we went back and forth through like a dozen emails, but I got what I wanted out of it. So I think it's as long as you have some degree of control over the book you're doing and the work that's going into it, I don't see anything wrong with going with a conventional publisher. Cory probably has a lot more experience, 30 books. My goodness, he's really been around the bend on this question. But I really think it's important to have some degree of control over your work and not to just give that all to the publisher and let them do whatever they want with it.
So as you heard, and you may not have known this, members of the audience, that I released several of my novels, all of my novels until 2017, when my publisher made me stop, under Creative Commons licenses that allowed for free, non-commercial distribution of that work. And I still release my newsletter on those terms. In fact, even on more generous terms, my newsletter is released under a license that allows for free commercial distribution. And some of that work has been picked up without payment, as the license permits, by Condé Nast publications like Wired, and some Financial Times, Die Zeit, other magazines and newspapers have paid me absolutely top dollar for things that they could have had for free. So for whatever it's worth, it seems like the deciding factor, or the dispositive factor about whether or not I get paid for something is not related to the license under which it's released. Let me step back one step and talk a little about what I like about copyright and what I don't, and what led me to that decision to release under Creative Commons licenses. So I'm all for having a set of rules to regulate the industry that I work in. Again, my kid is going to college in the fall. I need to pay her tuition. I would like very much to know what the rules are, the framework, the legal framework for the contractual arrangements I make with the industrial entities who publish my work. And as important as what that framework says, and it's very important, we also have to agree who that framework applies to. So, I like the idea of us someday having effective bank regulation. That would be amazing, but I don't think it should apply to paying your kid allowance. And if we say, okay, well, the way we're going to figure out whether you're doing something bank-like is by setting a quantity threshold. If it's $1 million, it's bank-like. It's financial enough. You've got to do some financial regulatory paperwork. Then that would be fine, unless we had hyperinflation. And then we said, okay, well, now that it costs $1 million to buy a sandwich, every time you buy a friend a sandwich, you are a bank, and you have to file paperwork with the SEC. And we can all understand why that would be very silly. So copyright has a set of rules, and I've got mixed feelings about those rules. I think some of them are very good. I think some of them are poor. But copyright also foundationally incorporates a test about whom it applies to, because copyright regulation is triggered when you make, display, perform, adapt a creative work. And historically, that was a pretty good proxy for industrial activity, right? If you're going to make a copy of a book, you had a printing press. If you're going to make a copy of a film, you had a film lab. If you're going to make a copy of a record, you had a record press. And while there were some edge cases that were weird edge cases that this caught, oftentimes they were below the threshold for even being detected by a rights holder. And if they weren't, well, this was a minor injustice, right? That someone who probably shouldn't have had to hire a lawyer did have to hire a lawyer to figure out how to do something that wasn't foundationally industrial. But those tests are very poor in the age of the digital era. By a massive margin, trillions to one, the number of copies made in a non-industrial fashion of creative works outweigh the industrial copying of creative works. Every time you click a mouse, you make 6 copies of a copyrighted work, right? Hundreds of copies, depending on the network architecture between you and the other side, right? It doesn't make you a publisher. And a lot of normal activities that used to take place in the physical world now take place in the digital world, like writing fanfic, or dressing up as characters, or putting on little skits about the work that you love. This is something people have done since time immemorial, right? The Hebrews stole Genesis from the Babylonians. It's Babylonian fanfic, So we've been doing this for as long as we've been telling stories, and it is weird. It's not just weird; it's incoherent to ask people who aren't doing industrial things to figure out how to follow industrial rules, right? Like, so I live in Burbank, walking distance to Fox, or rather Warner, Disney, and Universal. And I at Halloween, will often see kids ringing my doorbell in adorable Harry Potter costumes because Universal Studios is just up the street. And when Universal built the Harry Potter theme area, they had lawyers go over to Warner and negotiate the licenses. But if those kids want to write Harry Potter fanfic, even though they live in Burbank and can walk to the Warner gates and ring the bell and ask to speak to a Warner lawyer, no one's going to talk to them, right? There's no way that they are going to be able to get those licenses. There should be some rules probably for how everyday individuals use our works, but they can't be the same rules that we apply to Warner's or Universal or Disney. It just doesn't make any sense. Either we make the rules so simple that like a 12-year-old writing fanfic can follow them correctly without going astray, or we make them fit for purpose, which means they have to be complicated enough to manage a deal as complicated as the one that led to the Harry Potter theme park being built at Universal. Can't be both. And if we simplify it to the point where children can follow it while doing normal things that normal people have done for as long as literature has existed, then we will render it so simple that when our agents go to negotiate our livelihoods, it won't make any sense. And so I was releasing these Creative Commons works in part to say, look, there's a regime that makes sense for everyday people. Mostly it should be normative. It probably shouldn't even be statutory. Mostly it should be in the realm of like, this is what a good person does in relation to the art that they love and the artists that they love. And one way to establish those norms and have moral authority over your readers in respect of those norms is to treat them as with respect and to honor them instead of calling them thieves. I mean, even if you think they are a thief, calling them a thief is not going to really result in productive dialogue. But my confession to you is that I laid my hands on all the literature, music, and film I could when I was growing up, irrespective of how I got it, because I was a young artist and I wanted to read, watch, and listen to everything. I spent all my money on all the art I could buy, and then I got all the art that I needed that I couldn't afford by some other means. And those people are my peers. And so I did that. And to return back to my original point, some of the works that I released under Creative Commons were really big, right? The Little Brother, I think the series has now sold more than 1 million copies. The book Little Brothers probably sold about 500,000 copies. It's really big success. Some of them didn't do as well. Since I stopped doing Creative Commons licensing, I've had some big bestsellers. I've had, to my incredible delight, 3 USA Today national bestsellers in the last 16 months. And some of them have not. And my conclusion is that the licensing regime is only tangentially related to the commercial success of the work. But Karma, as you said, you're somewhat at the mercy of the superstitions of the people who publish your work or their beliefs or what have you. And that's very tough. Weirdly, it seems like the smaller presses might have more ossification and more fear because their margins are tighter, because they're one misstep away from collapse, because they're benevolent dictatorships run by one weirdo who's the kind of person who starts a poetry magazine, which is by definition not a reasonable person. And so you can end up in these situations where you're arguing with someone who has very strongly held beliefs that aren't evidence grounded, and they're running a dictatorship, of one, and you can't say otherwise. Sometimes those smaller presses are at the mercy of larger institutions because they can't do it all. So I did a couple of nonfiction books in the last couple of years with Beacon, which is the Universalist Unitarian press. Has been around for like 160 years. Albert Einstein once said, if there's hope for the future, it is in the Universalist Unitarians and Beacon Press. And I did another book with Verso, which is this very respected leftist publisher based in New York and London. Both are distributed by Random House. And Macmillan allows me to release all my books without digital rights management. So if you buy it on a Kindle, you can move it to a Kobo or somewhere else. So I'm not locking my readers to Amazon and then making myself subject to Amazon's tender mercies, because once my readers are locked to Amazon, then I'm locked to Amazon because that's where my readers are. But Verso, being distributed by Random House, didn't have that luxury. Random House refuses to distribute without DRM, even if the publisher wants it. So in that case, both of those cases, Random House and Verso and Beacon, I was able to contractually get terms that allowed me to be the electronic distributor of my work. So Random House only distributes the physical books, but the digital books are distributed by me, and I set up Kindle and Kobo and Ingram and all those other accounts, and I distribute it. And once every 3 months, I go through and I figure out how much money I've been paid for the Verso book and how much for the Beacon book, and I take 30%, which is what Amazon would take, and I send 70% to those publishers, and then they take 25%. They send it back to me as my royalties. It's nuts, right? But that's how we make it work. And there are publishers you can make it work with, but in a world of 5 giant publishers, 4 giant studios, 3 giant labels, 2 giant ad tech companies, and 1 company that controls all the ebooks and the audiobooks, we on the labor side of this have very little power, except through collective action. In the same way that tech workers were convinced by their bosses that they were founders in waiting, I think a lot of us have been convinced by the capital side of our markets that we are small businesses, we're entrepreneurs, and we're not. We're creative workers. And the Hollywood strikes showed us that the way that you get stuff done with the buyer side for our labor is with organized union action, and not by bargaining harder as an individual in a circumstance where you have very little bargaining leverage. And I'll finish with this because I've got to run, but I'll finish with this. In an environment where we have so much oligarchic control over the buy side of creative labor, creating more individual rights that creators bargain with is really just creating more individual rights that we end up bargaining away, right? So I have complicated feelings about AI training. I'm not super happy with it for various reasons, but I think that if you gave me the right to decide who could control or who could train a model with my work, Macmillan would just modify their contracts to say, we won't publish your books unless you sign that right over to us, as with Random House, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, and so on, right? They have means, motive, and opportunity to do that. Yeah, they're pissed off that Sam Altman is training models on the works they've published, but that's because they want to get paid for the training of those models, not because they don't want those models to be used in an attempt to immiserate, displace, or lower our wages, right? The only thing they hate more than Sam Altman training his models with their works is paying us. And so, giving us more rights where we have no bargaining power, it's like giving bullied kids extra lunch money. It doesn't matter how much lunch money you give the bullied kid. They are not buying lunch, right? The bullies are taking all the money. So I'll plug a book I wrote about this. It's called Choke Point Capitalism. Rebecca Solnit. She's there in the Bay Area. Rebecca Giblin, a Melbourne lawyer, and I wrote this book about how the entertainment cartel steals from creative workers and the tech cartel, and 6 specific shovel-ready reforms to copyright that would actually strengthen creative workers' power instead of giving us more that we sign away to our bosses. And I really do have to run. I'm hosting a radio series for the CBC, and we had a rights problem, and we have to re-record a bunch of tomorrow's episode. So I've got to go.
Well, thank you so much
all
for
very
being
much.
here, Cory.
Thank you, Cory.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask everybody to drop their links, especially if you have a free giveaway, and we can find Cory's links and drop those. Don't worry about that. So at this point, I'd love to hear a round of applause to send Cory away. Unmute yourselves, make noise. Woo!
And hi to Kristen's son, Donald.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now let's turn off the spotlights. And I just want to hear shout outs from everybody. What the concept you got from today. There were such amazing talking points in terms of writing to resist, right to resist. So I just want to hear what your takeaways, everybody's takeaways. And you can drop them in the chat. And Carol, if you and David, if you guys have any links you want to put in, I'm going to drop a link to a freebie from me. And if you have any giveaways, drop them out. But let's hear what you got, everybody.
You're the best mom in the world. I'm just wondering, can we send email questions? I have a question about censorship, but since we don't have time, can I email it to the panelists?
Why don't you just drop it in the chat, and then everybody's going to get the chat emailed to
Okay.
them.
Okay.
And,
Thanks, Kristen.
I
sure.
thought that I should go to protests, and no matter how hard that is, and take people with me. But I also got a lot about building bridges to create coalitions that will result in additional power. So everybody said so many valuable things.
Yeah, yeah. Again, thank you so much, Cheryl, for digging up these amazing individuals and these creatives to writers to talk to us.
They are amazing.
Yeah, we
all
got
three.
great stuff. I'm so inspired now.
I just want to remind everyone that following our speakers, we usually and still do our marketing and craft support group. So you don't if you're not interested in that, you can always drop out after this. But if you stick around, we will be doing the marketing and craft support group for writers next. As part of this.
I'm dropping another thing in the chat. If you guys want to join me on my book launch adventure next week, I'm doing a co-interview with Stephen Zolno, who's written 8 books about democracy. It's called Dinner Table Democracy, and it's based on parenting leadership styles and what parenting and politics have in common. So that I just put that in the chat too. I really love the idea, the 3.5% idea. David.